Deculain looked down at him, the difference in their heights framing the scene perfectly. He addressed Professor Relin, stating that he had heard Relin had been looking for him. Relin stammered in confusion, unable to comprehend why the senior professor was there. Deculain coldly demanded that Relin speak and tell him what he had been complaining about, adding that he didn't have all day. Relin's eyes darted around in panic, his mind racing. He hesitantly mentioned the club, to which Deculain confirmed that he had been the one to grant them permission. Still bewildered, Relin asked why, only for Deculain to sharply retort whether he needed a reason or should have sought Relin's permission first. Internally, Deculain was seething. Yariel had been pestering him since dawn like a mosquito with a vendetta, and now this walking incompetence was wasting his time. Well, Deculain had spent 8.02 million elmas, which is around $5,694,200. Worse, Relin was dripping with sweat, which caused his misophobia to kick in, making the situation even more unpleasant. Relin's breathing grew labored as he desperately searched for an escape. His body trembled, his thoughts in complete disarray. Stammering, he tried to backtrack, insisting that wasn't what he meant. Then, in a sudden burst of inspiration, he loudly declared that the place was far too shabby. The club members exchanged confused glances at his outburst. Gesturing wildly at the club room's interior, Relin barked that he had simply thought the mages of the Imperial University's Mage Tower deserved better equipment and furniture. He claimed it had upset him terribly to see things in such poor condition. After his desperate excuse, he let out a deep sigh, then immediately forced a bright smile. He promised to take responsibility and replace everything with something better. Deculain remarked dryly that Relin was always so considerate, agreeing that the room did look old and worn. Internally, Deculain dismissed the idea of Relin being kind as nonsense. Relin scratched his head, grinning widely as he assured Deculain he would take special care. Deculain turned to leave but paused, casting a sidelong glance at Beck, who flinched under his gaze. With icy disdain, Deculain called them worthless cockroaches who always behaved like the insects they were. His warning sent them scattering away, true to their nature. In the novel, Deculain's glare had fixed on the crowd, specifically the group that had urged Relin on. He knew them well: Beck, Isaiah, and Upern. With that, Deculain strode off down the corridor. Behind him, Beck stared at his back. In Class A, 3rd floor, the students had been murmuring among themselves before the lecture began. One mentioned that it had been a while since Professor Deculain's last class. Another pointed out that he had been in Bert recently, sparking curiosity about what might have happened there. A third admitted they didn't know the details but mentioned that the Wizard Journal had reported something about a train incident. Another student chimed in, confirming they'd seen the report too, how an entire train had floated midair, which they called unbelievable. Someone else wondered aloud if Deculain would share anything about Bert during class. Then, from the podium, Deculain cut through the noise with a single command, demanding silence before announcing the start of the lecture. He introduced the day's topic, pure elements and magic interference. He explained that magic interference occurred when one mage disrupted another's spell. Before delving deeper, he announced they would start with a warm-up exercise. At that moment, Alan entered, carrying a large bag. With a flick of basic, beginner psychokinesis, Deculain made its contents, 150 blue mana stones, float midair. The students' eyes widened in awe. Mana stones were invaluable, used in research, production, catalysts, and even as temporary magic amplifiers, a wizard's ultimate multi-tool. Each stone drifted toward a student, hovering just out of reach. Deculain then set the challenge. Each stone was worth 3,000 elm, and if anyone could wrest one from his control through interference, they could keep it. Epherine's eyes lit up with greed. 3,000 elm was roughly $2,000. She let out an excited squeal before her friend clamped a hand over her mouth. Deculain shot her an annoyed look before continuing. He explained that resisting interference was just as crucial as performing it. Though the defender had the advantage, he encouraged them to try anyway. He stood motionless, effortlessly maintaining control over all 150 stones while the students struggled to seize even one. Internally, Deculain reflected on his own progress. Though he'd recently stopped and lifted an entire train, he had only just memorized basic beginner psychokinesis. He needed more practice to master it fully. He was also curious, even against debutantes, how long could he sustain his hold against 150 mages? Who among them had the skill to break through? Ephereine grinned as she poured mana into her interference. She thought greedily about how expensive mage supplies were and how her sponsorship money was nearly gone. Now that Deculain was handing out free magic stones, she was determined to gratefully take one. Nearby, Sylvia watched Ephereine from the corner of her eye before hardening her resolve. She refused to lose and sharpened her focus, pushing harder. Around them, other students groaned, trembled, and some even coughed up blood from the strain. Standing beside Deculain, Alan was stunned. He remarked that the professor was incredible. He hadn't left a single opening, not even against 150 opponents. The students couldn't interfere at all. Deculain mused that even he was surprised. He hadn't expected them to exhaust themselves so thoroughly without success. Then, a single mana stone trembled. A thin strand of foreign mana had latched onto it. Unsurprisingly, the victor was Sylvia. Panting, she lowered her head, then turned to Ephereine with a smirk. Deculain praised her, declaring she was in first place. Sylvia nodded silently in triumph. He scanned the room, noting that Sylvia's success was expected. As he prepared to conclude the exercise, another stone shook. A second student had broken through. It was Ephereine, her face flushed, nose bleeding, but grinning wildly. "Heh heh, I did it," she cheered. "My 3,000 elm." Sylvia's smirk vanished into a glare. Other students had exerted their utmost effort, yet the challenge had been far more formidable than expected. No, it had been beyond merely formidable. They had pushed themselves to physical extremes, taking in their ashen faces and anguished expressions. Deculain recognized they had reached complete depletion. He abruptly commanded them to stop, acknowledging he had miscalculated the challenge's difficulty. Without delay, he retrieved all mana stones into the bag and dissolved his psychokinesis, leaving the drained students moaning like corpses. He was going to say something to them, but the classroom's state demanded silent observation. The mingled saliva and blood created a nauseating metallic stench that momentarily unsettled even him. An involuntary "pathetic" escaped his lips, further thickening the oppressive atmosphere. Regardless, he wanted nothing more than to depart. Announcing a temporary break, Deculain instructed them with obvious disdain to clean their disgusting mess. The novice wizards felt their confidence shatter against an insurmountable wall. Deculain's psychokinesis had proven an unconquerable fortress, leaving them stunned and confused. How could such basic telekinesis demonstrate such overwhelming power? Traditionally, psychokinesis was considered elementary magic, weak without natural talent and hardly a prestigious discipline. Yet Deculain's flawless execution raised disturbing questions about his other capabilities and the exceptional purity of his mana. Less accomplished mages sought solace in these rationalizations. Julia, still recovering, demanded an explanation from Ephereine about her success where so many had failed completely. Ephereine, barely coherent as she complained about numbness reaching even her tongue. Despite her rudimentary psychokinesis knowledge, she explained how she had instinctively penetrated Deculain's magic matrix. This revelation had granted her a sudden understanding of the spell's architecture, allowing her to manipulate the stones slightly. She shared her epiphany with an astonished Julia. True growth came from challenging masters, not peers. Nearby, Sylvia listened in simmering silence. She couldn't comprehend how the formerly lowest-ranked student had suddenly risen to second place, suspecting Deculain of giving Ephereine secret instruction despite his denials. Watching Ephereine lovingly caress her reward only deepened Sylvia's resentment, prompting muttered accusations of arrogant woman toward those who seemed to bask in their professor's apparent favoritism, at least in Sylvia's judgment. The classroom fell silent the moment Deculain returned to the lecture. He addressed the students about their earlier struggles with magic interference. He revealed there had been an easier method they might have discovered: mana interference. Those who had succeeded might have started to grasp it. Deculain explained that while traditional magic interference blocked already cast spells, mana interference worked by analyzing and disrupting an opponent's casting sequence before completion. However, he cautioned that this advanced technique came with significant limitations that reduced its practicality in real combat situations. A student thought incredulously about the immense knowledge required. One would need to memorize countless spell formulas to attempt such interference. Deculain, as if anticipating this reaction, acknowledged that practitioners could only interfere with spells whose formulas they already understood, which explained its unpopularity. Most wizards preferred simpler defenses or direct counters. His piercing gaze swept across the room as he emphasized that true mastery required dedication. "Without pain, there's no gain," he declared, urging them to study this technique thoroughly. To illustrate his point, he demonstrated how every spell contained a distinctive core circuit pattern that served as the key to disruption. He assured them that once identified, even complex magic interference would become trivial. To demonstrate, he summoned several magic circles in the air. First, he pointed out, piercing gale blade, explaining that destruction spells always featured circuits radiating outward, like detonations frozen mid-blast. The students watched in awe as he shared these closely guarded secrets that most wizards would protect jealously, like dragons guarding gold. Yet Deculain shared it freely. Next, for a support-type spell, he continued. The students scribbled furiously, hanging on every syllable. His very pronunciation seemed to engrave itself in their minds, a positive manifestation of his overawe and grace. 2 hours evaporated instantly. At precisely 6 p.m., Deculain ceased mid-sentence and announced that it was all for today. There's still content left, but time's up. The class stirred uneasily. Deculain's punctuality bordered on compulsion. No early dismissals, no overtime. 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock, always. A student hesitantly spoke up, pointing out that they hadn't covered easing interference with pure elements. Deculain cut in, stating that they had wasted time earlier and thus had no grounds for complaints. He told them to deduce the rest through their own ingenuity. Straightening his coat, he reminded them that their midterms are approaching, preceded by a public practical. Today's material was critical. They should study it thoroughly. With that, he dismissed them and exited, leaving stunned silence in his wake. The moment he left, murmurs erupted. "Why quit halfway? What's his problem?" one student muttered. "Ugh, this feels like being interrupted mid-shit," another groaned. While Julia voiced her frustration loudly about being expected to imagine the rest, Ephereine laughed in agreement, though privately she felt satisfied with her small personal breakthrough. Then, a sneering voice cut through. Beck, poorly mimicking Deculain's cadence, called out, "Hey, representative of the commoners, Ephereine." Julia bristled, demanding to know why Beck was picking a fight with them again. She reminded him that last time, he had dragged Professor Relin over, and now he was acting like he couldn't even stand seeing them. She asked what his problem was. Officially, the tower rejected status distinctions. Unofficially, nobles like Beck found ways to enforce them. Beck smirked and mocked Ephereine, saying it was because a commoner like her didn't know her place and kept showing off. He questioned how she had jumped from dead last to second place. Ephereine thought, just ignore him. But, she retorted, "HM, even if I told you," Beck interrupted. "Shameless stray, did you bribe him?" Ephereine glared angrily and demanded to know what he had just said. Beck scoffed and asked if he had said something wrong. He claimed that everyone knew she had been receiving private lessons from Professor Deculain. Ephereine shouted that it wasn't true. Sylvia looked at them weirdly. Beck challenged her to explain herself. How could a half-wit like her, who had never graduated from the academy, improve so much in such a short time? He sneered, suggesting that perhaps Professor Deculain had gone easy on her. Maybe he had wanted to sneakily gift a magic stone to the pitiful wench there. That would explain things. Then he added mockingly, "A girl like you with no house or parents can't have." Ephereine was ready to fight. Mana gathered in her bracelet as she gritted her teeth. She dared him to finish that sentence. Ephereine could have threatened to report Beck's slander to Deculain. The cockroach would have crumbled at the thought of crossing the professor. Beck taunted her, saying she really thought her threats would work on him. Ephereine shot back, telling him to keep yapping if he wasn't scared. Julia nervously urged Ephereine not to do it, asking what she would do if she got involved in another disciplinary hearing. Ephereine remembered she had already been to the disciplinary room. The mana in her bracelet dissipated. Ephereine lowered her head. Julia thought she was upset and extended a hand. But Ephereine smiled. She thanked Julia, saying she was right. She had gotten a bit too worked up. Julia happily called out, "Ephie!" Ephereine smirked and remarked that talking to a dimwit like Beck must have made her lose a few brain cells. Julia grinned in relief, saying it was all good now that she had calmed down. Beck fumed. "Huh?" But Ephereine and Julia ignored him, already heading out. Ephereine suggested they get something to eat on the way back. Julia agreed immediately. Beck shouted after them, demanding to know where they thought they were going. Sylvia watched the pair depart. Under the quiet evening sky, Ephereine trudged along the university pathways, kicking at the cobblestones. Her dinner had done little to ease her anger toward Beck. She muttered to herself that she had barely restrained herself earlier thanks to Julia, but questioned how she would handle Beck moving forward. She admitted that seeing his face might push her to snap next time. As she walked, she grumbled about what she should do with that haughty little noble bastard. Turning a corner, she noticed Sylvia standing deliberately in her path. Sylvia stated that they needed to talk, prompting Ephereine to wonder suspiciously what Sylvia wanted. Bristling, Ephereine warned that if Sylvia was looking for a fight, she had chosen a bad time and told her to leave her alone. Sylvia, crossing her arms, asked directly if Ephereine was receiving private lessons from Deculain. Ephereine snapped, accusing Sylvia of starting trouble and demanding why she would even ask such a thing, given her history with Deculain. She questioned why she would ever let him tutor her and insisted Sylvia knew nothing. Frustrated, she asked if Sylvia had really stopped just to say something so absurd, exclaiming that everyone seemed out to annoy her today. Sylvia observed Epherine's outburst calmly, concluding internally that Ephereine was telling the truth. She dismissed the matter, saying it was fine then. As Ephereine began to protest, Sylvia cut her off, revealing that after Epherine's father's death, Deculain had not entered his laboratory for 3 years. Not even once. Ephereine laughed sharply, stating it was obvious since Deculain was incapable without her father, whom she proudly called a genius. Sylvia, unfazed, continued, noting that 3 months ago Deculain had begun visiting the lab daily, cleaning it, hiring an assistant professor, and purchasing numerous magic items. She asked Ephereine what she thought that meant. Epherine's smirk faded, and she stiffened as she processed the implication. Internally, she questioned if Deculain was attempting to resume her father's research, doubting he had the capability or right to do so alone. Clenching her fist briefly, she shrugged it off, casually remarking that it sounded like he was experimenting, as professors do, and asked what it had to do with her. Satisfied, Sylvia turned to leave, stating over her shoulder that it was nothing, and she had only mentioned it in case Ephereine was unaware. Left alone, Ephereine stood rooted in place, her thoughts churning as the night deepened around her. A few days later on the practical day, Ephereine found herself standing before a vast expanse, its boundaries stretching beyond her sight. At its heart lay a rectangular stage resembling a grand stadium. The gathered students buzzed with anticipation, their voices filling the air with excitement. Julia, standing beside Ephereine, questioned what kind of practical training Professor Deculain had planned and why he had brought them to such a place. Ephereine, equally puzzled, responded that she had no idea but suspected Deculain was up to something, as usual. Suddenly, Beck barged into Julia with force, prompting her to bristle and call him a jerk. Ephereine, sighing, restrained Julia, urging her to let it go. At precisely 3 o'clock, Deculain appeared at the entrance, and the noisy chatter instantly fell silent. He commanded silence, announcing that class was beginning. He reminded the students that this was the final practical training session before the midterm exams, and with a snap of his fingers, he lifted a veil at the stadium's edge, revealing a crowd of hundreds of spectators. He declared that the day's class would be a public exercise, startling Ephereine and her classmates. Ephereine, wide-eyed, remarked on the sheer number of people present. Deculain explained that students could use any magic to battle one another, but they were required to employ at least 3 pure elemental spells. He clarified that winning or losing was irrelevant. He would focus solely on evaluating the battles, noting each student's strengths and weaknesses to aid their development. He added that Professor Relan, from the Department of Assistive Studies, would ensure no casualties occurred so they could fight without restraint. Relan, appearing with a cheerful laugh, assured everyone he would keep the students safe, clearly relishing the attention from both wizards and spectators. Deculain then called for the exercise to begin, summoning Urozan first. Urozan, caught off guard, hesitantly acknowledged the call and climbed onto the stage. After a moment's hesitation, he chose his friend Lawton as his opponent. The two faced each other, tension crackling between them. Deculain gave them 3 minutes and signaled the start. Initially, their magic clacked awkwardly. Urozan conjured a thin veil of fire that enveloped Lawton, who countered by disrupting it with mana. The flames extinguished, producing steam that Lawton froze into sharp, metal-like spikes and hurled at Urozan. The magical spars unfolded smoothly, each exchange growing more confident. Deculain observed closely, his fountain pen autonomously scribbling notes as he monitored the battles. At first, the students' inexperience with such a format made their movements hesitant, but they gradually adapted, focusing intently and casting their spells with increasing precision. As the battle raged on, punctuated by a blazing fire blast, Sylvia emerged triumphant. Off to the side, Beck sneered, mocking the defeated commoner and suggesting they should have applied to be servants at his estate rather than bothering to attend the mage tower. His follower cackled in agreement. Ephereine, glaring from the sidelines, thought furiously that those arrogant nobles were despicable and that Sylvia could have easily defeated them too. Aloud, she shouted encouragement to Ferret, telling him he did great despite his loss. Deculain's voice cut through the noise, calling Beck to the stage next and instructing him to choose an opponent. With a smirk, Beck named Ephereine. She shot him a fierce glare, thinking to herself that this suited her just fine, and strode confidently onto the stadium. Beck taunted her, questioning if she'd be alright without someone secretly coaching her on how to win. Ephereine, undeterred, retorted sharply, dismissing his nonsense and mocking his habit of pointless babbling, likely learned from his parents. She added that his imitation of Deculain's style was utterly pathetic. Beck bristled at her words, demanding to know what she meant. Ephereine raised her hand, mana swirling around her bracelet, and declared she'd prove his magic was as weak as character. Both charged forward. Beck, enraged, called her a lowly maggot and unleashed a destructive spell, boasting it would reunite her with her parents. The spell swept toward Ephereine, shattering the ground with a deafening bang. Her friend cried out in horror, fearing for her safety. Beck laughed, pouring more mana into his spell, but confusion crossed his face as green mana disrupted his magic. Ephereine, unscathed, had interfered with his spell. She announced that an old proverb had been on her mind since arriving at the Mage Tower. One she claimed stated that nobles deserved a beating. With deft control, she turned Beck's own spell against him. Beck screamed, stumbling back as Ephereine shaped the mana into a fist that sent him flying across the stage. Julia cheered enthusiastically, noting in amusement that no such proverb existed. Beck sprawled on the ground, groaned in pain, tears welling in his eyes. Ephereine loomed over him, casting a shadow, and asked how it felt to be crushed by a so-called maggot. Professor Relin declared Ephereine the winner. Beck, humiliated by a commoner's victory, muttered that she'd only gotten lucky. Deculain, observing, took notes as his enchanted fountain pen scribbled autonomously. He remarked in frustration that the students' fights had ended too quickly, rendering the presence of the invited guests pointless, as they hadn't witnessed anything noteworthy. Ephereine, about to step off the stage, paused at Deculain's words. She turned and boldly requested another chance. Placing a hand on her chest, she pointed out that the assignment required casting 3 pure elemental spells, but she'd only managed 1 due to her opponent's weakness, which ended the match prematurely. Deculain acknowledged her point, noting that it would be unfair to evaluate her incompletely through no fault of her own, but rather her opponent's inadequacy. He granted her permission to select another opponent from anyone present. Ephereine extended her scarred, calloused finger, proof of relentless effort, and pointed directly at her chosen target. With unwavering resolve, she announced that she chose Professor Deculain himself as her opponent.